but we're also here for another reason, and that is to discuss our budget. And this has been a team effort, and I've got certain members of my team that are here today as we worked all together on preparing, we think, a budget that is visionary and a budget that emphasizes the priorities to keep our economy improving, create jobs, help education, help close the skills gap here in North Carolina, and also help build future infrastructure for the state of North Carolina. I'd like some of the members of our team to please stand up when they're recognized, and if they could all stand up, just stay standing as they, so you'll know who's in the audience. Chief of Staff Thomas Stiff, who's Secretary Aldona Voss, Health and Human Services, Public Safety, Secretary Frank Perry, Deputy Secretary Bill Bryan from Department of Administration. Bill, great seeing you. Deputy Secretary Nick Tennyson of DOT. The DOT Secretary is celebrating the 100th anniversary of DOT over at the DOT building today with a wonderful group of individuals. Deputy Secretary John Evans of Diener, great seeing you, John. Secretary Susan Klutz of Cultural Resources. Our CIO Chris Estes. Our Military Affairs Advisor Cornell Wilson, who I'll be traveling with Camp Lejeune later on this afternoon. Education Advisor Eric Gucan, Director Neil Alexander, Personnel Director, and Secretary Lyons Gray. And thank you all very much. Thank you all. Y'all give them a round of applause for all the work they've done. Appreciate that. Let me just tell you some guidelines that I gave our team as we've worked through this budget process during the last several months. These are the guidelines and the directives that I gave them. First, we had to continue to focus on efficiency and demand fiscal discipline and accountability. The budget is still extremely tight, and therefore we had to continue to look for efficiencies and look for the best way we can direct our money. We also wanted to create a competitive economic opportunities for job creators and hardworking families that are living paycheck to paycheck. I wanted to make sure our next generation is prepared for the careers of today and tomorrow through innovation, education, and training. This was a major emphasis of this budget. And we also wanted to work on infrastructure regarding connecting opportunities throughout our state by investing in critical infrastructure like roads, bridges, ports, communications, and energy, which will benefit generations to come. And also, I think, even more important than anything, and this is a very important part of Secretary Voss's job, and that is to help and protect those that cannot help themselves while encouraging those who can. And that's a basic philosophy of this administration, is help and protect those who cannot help themselves while encouraging those who can. And that's the best of North Carolina, and while looking for efficiency and effectiveness while also caring for those in need. Now, we've had to make some tough choices in this budget, but we are investing in the areas that will have the biggest impact on the citizens of North Carolina. And we're going to be working with the legislature, Jimmy Broughton, who's also with my staff. Great to have you here, Jimmy. Jimmy had a little slip and fall last week on the black ice, and it's great to see you back. But we're very, very lucky to have Jimmy Broughton. We'll be working with the legislature regarding some of the next steps, which we'll explain after the presentation. But I'm so fortunate to have such a great budget director. I didn't think anyone could fill Art Pope's shoes. But Lee Roberts has brought a amount of intelligence and an outside viewpoint that is beyond anything we expected. And he and his budget team, which is in front to my right, have put in a tremendous amount of work in this budget. My role in this is that we did a little bit differently this year. Instead of looking at each department or each area in silos and me reviewing every line of each department, one department at a time, we looked at the bigger picture as we went through the budget. So we were able to prioritize not just within the silos of state government, but looking at state government as a whole. And I thought that process worked extremely well. As governor, I literally went through a $21 billion budget down to expenses down to about $500,000 in reviewing this budget. And it was a long, difficult process, and it was a process in which we had to make very difficult decisions. But That's what we were elected to do, and we did that by prioritizing and working within the budget that we have, just like families are having to do throughout North Carolina. So with that, I'm going to have Lee Roberts give a very extensive overview of the budget, and then Lee and I will come back to answer any questions. And I just want to let the media know that Lee will be answering most of the questions, just like I had my previous budget director answer most of the questions. So with that, please give a round of applause to our budget director, Lee Roberts.
Governor, thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming out to the Emergency Operations Center here on what promises to be a wintry day. If the weather turns against us, though, we're in the best possible place. So, as the governor said, the budget gets put together with a lot of hard work from a lot of people, and I do want to recognize the team from the Office of State Budget and Management, many of whom are sitting over here. They're as dedicated and hardworking a group of public employees as you will find, and there's an extensive amount of work that goes into preparing this budget. It's a 2-year budget, and this team is highly experienced, highly intelligent, and truly committed. The amount of work that goes into preparing this, nights and weekends, I wish every taxpayer could see how much effort and hard work goes into preparing the budget. So thank you to all of you. As the governor said, we're going to try and talk about the budget a little bit more thematically than maybe has been done in prior years. There's a tendency for those of us in state government to talk about the budget in the way that state government is organized, and that's not always the most effective way, I think, to communicate the budget. And so you'll see a mix of thematic discussion and then a little bit more of the laundry list, just going through what happens for various priorities and each agency. I think the first thing that we would say about this budget is to repeat what the governor said, that this is a budget that is conservative and disciplined. It does not raise taxes. I'll say that again, this budget does not raise taxes, and that's something that we're proud of, because with a balanced budget amendment, if you don't raise taxes, the only tool that you have to balance the budget is to manage spending. And that's not always easy to do, but that's something that we worked hard to do in this budget. We have been a fiscally conservatively managed state. We have a AAA rating from all 3 ratings agencies. We're one of only 10 states in the country about whom that is true. Our debt service coverage ratings are better than average for those 10 states, so it's not an exaggeration to say that we're in the top 5, the top 10%, top 5 states of all states when it comes to the strength of our balance sheet, and that's something that we're committed as an administration. I know the General Assembly is committed to protect at all costs. This budget grows more slowly than inflation does, than our population does, and of course it's a balanced budget consistent not only with the Constitution but with responsible budgeting. I think many of you know that most of the general fund is already obligated by statute, so we're required to make commitments to the state health plan and to the retirement plan. About 76% of our new spending, which is about $741 million, is going to be dedicated to Medicaid, to enrollment for UNC and for the K through 12 system, and then to continuing to keep our promises to teachers, and I'll talk more about that. But 76% of all new spending devoted to education and Medicaid. Medicaid takes about 18% of our budget, $3.8 billion in the first year. We've reduced spending where we think we can and found efficiencies where we think we can. We operate off the consensus revenue estimate that's developed between the Budget Office and the Fiscal Research Division of the General Assembly, and so that consensus revenue estimate is what we're operating from. That shows a forecast of about 1.3% below what was originally budgeted. That's about $271 million. If we end up with more revenue as we get closer to the end of the year, we can revisit some of the decisions that we've made. So you never really know where you are from a revenue perspective until you get into March and April as individuals begin to file their individual income tax returns. And one thing that I think is worth mentioning, and one thing that we talk a lot about in the administration and in the cabinet is that this is not our money. We're going to collect almost $44 billion from taxpayers over the next 2 years. And we have an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, a financial obligation, really in many ways a moral obligation to use that money as wisely as possible. And if we can't use it effectively and efficiently and in an accountable way, then we should give it back to the people who earned it. And that's something that we try and keep in mind. The governor said that he looks at line item spending decisions down to a very fine level of detail. And that's the principle that we're thinking about is, can we look at all of you and say, we devoted this money in the most effective way possible. And that puts an obligation on us to spend that money where it matters most. People are often surprised when I show them this pie chart. People don't realize, I think generally, how much of our budget goes to education and to health and human services. 56% going to education, 70% of that goes to our K-12 system. And then 25% of our budget going to health and human services, more than 2/3 of that is Medicaid. If you add in justice and public safety, which includes the highway patrol and the prison system and the court system, you're at about 92% of our total general fund. And when you add debt service and reserves into that, basically everything else that we do in government, general government and natural and economic resources, that's our parks and the agriculture department and the labor department and everything else that you think of when you think of state government, fits into those small slivers there that represent about 3% of our total spending. In terms of priorities, the largest discretionary priority in this budget is keeping the promise that was made in the last session to bring all teachers to a starting salary of $35,000 a year. Largest discretionary item in the budget. It's more than $500 million in new funding for K through 12 education in the next 2 years. When you add that to the $305 million increase in teacher pay that was passed in the last budget, and that 305 is still there, that gets funded in each of the next 2 years. In the governor's first term, he will have spent over $1 billion, over $1 billion in new money in teacher pay, in K through 12 teacher pay. And we think that's, if you come away with one statistic from this presentation, that's the one to remember. We have also tried, in an era of continued austerity, as the governor said, to recognize a number of other areas of state government in terms of salary increases. So we're fully funding the step increase for the highway patrol. Our corrections officers have not seen their pay scale increased since the mid-1980s. We have 10,000 correction officer ones in the state of North Carolina, and they make less than $30,000 a year on average. The prisons that they work in vary greatly in terms of how dangerous they are, in terms of what kinds of inmates they house, and so we're beginning to raise the pay for corrections officers. We're doing it on a phased basis, but we're beginning that process over the next 2 years. We pay longevity pay for about 40,000 state employees, which is something that often gets overlooked. And we're budgeting in this budget an $82 million salary exception fund, whose purpose, we hope, will be to attract and retain employees in hard-to-fill, hard-to-retain areas like information technology, accounting, and engineering. We've talked in the past, the governor has talked about our interest in proposing bond financing. And you will see from us shortly after the budget is introduced a proposal for 2 bonds, one for transportation infrastructure and one for other government infrastructure. We think these targeted long-term investments are vital to our continued competitiveness. These are assets that will last for 50 years. We'll pay for them over 20 years. They'll last for 50 years. We'll borrow money at historically low interest rates. We will not do anything to come close to jeopardizing the credit ratings that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And we think if you look around across the state at state-owned assets, most visibly our roads and our bridges, but also things like our National Guard facilities, our community colleges, some of the UNC campuses, our court system. There are needs that have built up after a long period of deferred spending and deferred maintenance that we hope to address through these bond issues. and invest in our continued competitiveness going forward, while also hopefully doing something beneficial for the main streets across North Carolina on which a lot of these facilities are located. The governor also talked about the priority we place in this budget on giving a helping hand to the disadvantaged. 18% of our state population is supported by Medicaid. We make significant new investments in this budget in mental health. We invest in pre-K, and there are other key social services like adoption and foster care that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. Now I'm going to talk in just a little bit more detail about each one of those aspects in the budget, and obviously we're looking forward to taking questions about any of this as well. I'll move through these slides reasonably quickly, but our budget grows more slowly than the population and inflation calculation that you see in the blue bars. The brown bar there is our proposed appropriations, and so you see we believe that this is a disciplined and conservative approach given the relative growth of the budget to population and to inflation. We're continuing to add to our reserves. We have a rainy day fund now of $650 million. We'll be allocating almost $50 million more dollars in this budget. Our revenue forecast, one point that I think gets missed sometimes in these discussions about the revenue forecast is that our revenue is growing strongly. And so the debate about how much revenue we have or that we're going to have is in the context of revenue that is continuing to grow as this chart makes clear. The difference there, that $271 million between $20.7 billion and $21.2 billion is the difference between what is forecast now based on that latest consensus forecast and what was originally budgeted. So the triangle in between those is the gap. That's not a significant gap compared to the overall growth in revenues that we're experiencing. And as I mentioned, if as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, the revenue picture is looking better than we currently forecast, then we'll revisit some of our spending priorities. We anticipate moderate growth in the budget. We're not making ambitious forecasts. We're trying to be conservative in the level of growth that we project here in the budget and the amount that we budget. You see about 4% over both years, a little bit less in year one, a little bit more in year two. And we're making significant investments in this budget in job creation and competitiveness. There's obviously the NC Competes package that is currently being debated in the General Assembly. There's also a series of initiatives in the budget itself. We've talked about the historic preservation tax credit, which is important to main streets across North Carolina. We've talked about the film grant program. We've allocated $20 million. That's $10 million in each year of the biennium. And then there are a series of tax credits that preserve jobs and attract jobs here in the state. And several of those will expire. Many of them expire in year two of the biennium, but we're proposing in this budget to extend those. And importantly, we're proposing extending the renewable energy credit only for non-solar projects. About 90% of the cost currently is in solar. We're proposing extending it for non-solar only. And there are some other tax credits in there for data centers, for R&D, smaller ones for motorsports and aviation fuel. When it comes to education, as I mentioned, the governor and the administration have made a significant commitment to K through 12 funding. You see here the increases in K through 12 funding represented in the last blue line by the last year's budget, the authorized budget, and the two green bars in what we're proposing in this budget. Continued significant increases in K through 12 funding. Again, most of our discretionary availability. We have to fund Medicaid. We have to fund projected enrollment growth. Most of the remaining discretionary availability goes to increasing K through 12 teacher salaries. $223 million, increasing teacher base pay to $35,000 and moving teachers along the salary pay scale. That's $223 million over the 2-year period, which is how all of these numbers are reflected. $207 million in enrollment growth, that's 1,400 new teachers. $128 million to retain teaching assistants, $15 million to the endowment fund to identify, reward, and retain highly effective teachers, $70 million for instructional resources. That includes online resources, textbooks, instructional supplies, professional development, and importantly, we're giving more discretion to the school districts to decide how to spend that money among those priorities. And then funding for pre-K, almost 27,000 at-risk 4-year-olds funded through the pre-K program. Moving on to higher education. And higher education is the community college system and the UNC system. There's a number of things here that we're funding for the UNC system and for community colleges. There's also a couple of places where we're asking the UNC system to identify efficiencies and to continue to make sure that they're using taxpayer money as efficiently and as effectively and as accountably as possible. So as the governor mentioned when he was in Greenville on Monday, we're funding $8 million each year to help stabilize the School of Medicine at East Carolina in Greenville. We're funding enrollment growth at almost $130 million over the biennium. We're providing in-state tuition for veterans, and we're funding that through new appropriation, which is different than many of our peer states do. We're funding the community colleges on the basis of their year-round enrollment rather than just their school year enrollment, which is a significant funding change, beneficial funding change for the community colleges. And we're allocating about $10 million for the community colleges in the areas of technology and education in the STEM fields. In the upper right is one of the efficiencies that I mentioned for the UNC system. We're asking that the UNC system not spend more than $1 million per campus on its private fundraising efforts. And that saves about $18 million a year. It affects 12 of the 17 campuses. So you can spend $1 million in state money in your efforts to raise non-state money, but we're asking for that limit to be capped at $1 million. Again, it affects 12 of the 17 campuses and saves $18 million. We're also asking, as we are with many parts of state government, including the budget office and the governor's office and the agriculture department, the labor department, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Commerce Department. As you know, we asked a series of agencies, all of the agencies, to identify 2% reductions in their budgets as a way. That's something that predates this administration, but it's a traditional way of trying to create some funding flexibility in the budget. In looking at the UNC system, because their budget is so large, that reduction for them is a larger dollar amount than many of the other reductions in the budget. But we're asking the UNC system to find efficiencies and shared services that amount to about $26 million. For comparison, that's about 1.2% of UNC's general fund budget, less than the 2% I just talked about. It's about 0.1% of their total budget. And we think that there are ways to find those efficiencies and those savings that have nothing to do with the quality of the classroom experience or educational excellence. Those are simply about being effective stewards of taxpayer money through shared services in IT, accounting, and back office. And that's obviously something that the Board of Governors has worked on extensively already. We are also investing through our Innovation to Jobs initiative $30 million in the Venture Multiplier Fund, which will go alongside private dollars. These dollars have to pass a private sector test before an investment is funded. The NC RISE program, which recruits investors and entrepreneurs to North Carolina, and the Innovation Commercialization Investment Program, which helps identify promising university technologies and funds the commercialization of them. I mentioned just a little bit about the UNC system, and I think it's worth mentioning that North Carolina spends a greater percentage of its tax revenues on higher education than any other state in the country, number 1 out of 50. And our capital expenditures per student, this combines community colleges and the UNC system. You see where we are compared to the 10 most populous states in the country, as well as to Virginia and South Carolina. We're dramatically above the national average, which is there in yellow. If you were just to take the UNC system, that number is closer to $14,000 per student. We're at about $2,000 per student for the community colleges, a little bit less than $6,000 per student in K through 12. Moving on to transportation funding. And as you know, most of this funding does not come out of the general fund. This is mostly separate funding from the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund $4.8 billion in highway infrastructure, transportation infrastructure funding, including new construction, maintenance, capital improvements, and easing congestion. We've talked a little bit about our efforts to make government a little bit more efficient and a little bit more responsive. The governor commissioned the first comprehensive study that had been done in at least 20 years in looking at government top to bottom to try and identify ways in which we could find savings and find efficiencies, identify ways that we can deliver better customer service and be innovative at the same time. That delivers $14 million in savings in year one alone. That begins to pick up speed. We have $57 million in savings from our NC Gear initiative in year two, over $600 million in savings over 10 years. And that's a present value number discounted back. Lots of times when you see these 10-year projections, they're using nominal dollars, and obviously future dollars are worth less than current dollars. So the $600 million is in present value savings from the NC Gear initiative. Some examples here, there's about 60 recommendations. We're just giving you a flavor of what they are here. We've talked about the merger of our management of cultural resources and natural resources, the significant effort required to improve our vital records function, recovering debts owed to the state through the Treasury Offset Program, rationalizing the way we own and use state vehicles, reducing our workers' compensation expense, which has spiraled completely out of control, and encouraging the local school districts to leverage their buying power by pooling together, which some local school districts are doing already. When it comes to supporting those who keep us safe both in the military and in public safety, I mentioned in-state tuition for veterans. We're combining a series of our state functions that serve the military and veterans to protect our military mission, protect our bases, serve veterans and active duty military more effectively, veterans courts, and the HERO initiative, which encourages law enforcement to hire veterans to use technology to help identify and rescue children in danger. On the public safety side, I mentioned the funding for corrections officers. That's a $60 million annual cost when it's fully phased in. We're beginning the phase in year two, so that's the $21 million that you see there. The step increases for the highway patrol, replacing law enforcement vehicles where there's significant deferred expenditure to be made for the SBI, the alcohol law enforcement, and the highway patrol, and then funding the crime lab to try and reduce the significant backlog that we've seen there. On the court system, the Chief Justice talked about the funding needed for the court system yesterday. We've allocated $16 million to the court system, which should address many of their cost concerns, many of their funding concerns. I also think that there's probably room in our bond recommendation to try and address some of the technology needs that the courts are experiencing. They need a fundamental technology overhaul, which is the kind of thing that's difficult to fund in an annual budget, which is partly why it hasn't been done already. And perhaps the bond proceeds a portion of the bond proceeds can be directed towards that priority. Expanding the business courts and clearing the backlog for public defenders with a $9 million appropriation and putting them on a more stable footing going forward. When we talk about helping the disadvantaged, helping those who can't help themselves and encouraging those who can, mental health is an important part of that. There's a significant priority placed on mental health in this budget. Mental health is obviously partly a public safety issue and partly a public health issue. In the public safety side of things, $24 million for behavioral health units in the prisons, as well as to open inpatient health beds at Central Prison that hadn't previously been funded. On the public health side, $82 million in new funding for mental health and substance abuse services, including new community mental health services and new state mental health services, including the funding here to open up New Broughton Hospital in Morganton, which will happen later this year. Other funding in the public health, Department of Health and Human Services area, the Chief Medical Examiner has been underfunded. We're trying to rectify that with a new appropriation in this budget. That's obviously a critical public service. Increased funding for adoption and for foster care, and continued investment in the NC Fast and NC Track systems, which are information technology systems that help both providers and patients manage care, receive care more effectively and more cost effectively. And then in the bottom, you see some points about Medicaid. The Medicaid rebase, that's the cost, the incremental cost in Medicaid in each year of the biennium. You see that's $287 million in the first year and $461 million in the second year. That's the incremental amount that Medicaid will cost based on our forecast beyond what it costs already. Medicaid reform, supporting our Healthy NC reform plan. We have a small amount of money budgeted to help design the new Medicaid reform structure, the provision of care, and then the risk reserve. Given the uncertainty in Medicaid forecasting, particularly in year 2, we have a significant risk reserve there of $175 million over 2 years to help guard against possible cost overruns in Medicaid. Again, in the DHHS budget, about 86% in general fund appropriations goes to medical assistance, which is Medicaid, and to mental health. So an enormous amount of money, as I mentioned earlier, 25% of the budget spent on DHHS, most of that going, as you see, 86% to medical assistance and to mental health. So with that, I'll hand it back over to the governor, and we look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Let's give Lee Roberts a round of applause. It's an incredible presentation. Again, our goal is to really continue to demand efficiency and effectiveness in how we deliver our services. And we're still fixing parts of government that have been broken for decades and investing in those areas and re-engineering those areas to make sure our taxpayers get the best bang for their hard work and tax dollars. Again, the second is we're putting a lot of new investment through our universities and the private sector in trying to create new economic opportunities to build careers for our citizens throughout North Carolina. And the third is we're really investing in trying to close that skills gap that we have between those seeking jobs to those that have job openings right now, because we want to bring those together to create more job opportunities and careers for the people of North Carolina through our education and also training areas. And building infrastructure of roads and bridges and rail and ports, major investments in infrastructure, which we think will have a major benefit for future generations. And last but not least, and probably the most important is, again, I want to stress that we're putting a major amount of money. The last several slides talked about helping those who can't help themselves, those who need certain medical services, and also encouraging ways to get people to become independent in their lives and help their families. So that's the basic philosophy that we've used. Let me just briefly talk about some next steps. Jimmy Broughton, my team, and others are going to be working with the legislature leaders, the committee chairs, all the legislators in trying to revise this and build upon this budget within the constraints that we have. And I'm very pleased in my first 2 years, probably about over 90% of our budget was implemented. But we're going to be working with the legislatures, look for continual improvement, and Lee and myself and others will be having legislators over to the executive mansion. We'll be working the hallways too and visiting their offices to see what improvements we can make and how we can work under the goals and objectives that I've set for our team. Also, 2 other things we're working on is we're going to be rolling out more information in the next several months or 2 regarding the bonds, the transportation bonds, where we'll be giving more details on exactly how we'll finance the transportation bonds and where that money will be directed. And then the second area is the bonds for other infrastructure throughout the state, the other $1.2 billion bond that we'll be requesting. Lee, during the last 2 to 3 weeks, and his team have been communicating with our university leaders, our community college leaders, other members of Council of State, and each of my departments to see what infrastructure they need for generations to come that we need to be investing in now. And as we get those lists, we're going to be prioritizing where we think certain infrastructure will have the biggest impact on the future of North Carolina. And again, I've stated as governor that I'm a big advocate of investing in infrastructure that will benefit generations to come, and now is the time to do just that. So Lee will be a major part of that process along with other members of our team, and I'm excited to see that priority list from our universities and from our K through 12 schools and our community colleges, and also from our transportation areas for potential and areas into airports and intermodals and ports and so forth that are desperately needed to keep our commerce and trade moving along. So with that, Lee and I are here to answer questions. As I've stated, I'm going to have Lee probably answer most of them. I'll talk at a higher level, but since this is on the top of his mind and my mind, I'm going to really use his expertise, and you can see his expertise in the new outlook that we're presenting, this, I think, visionary plan for the future under the constraints that we all have under the current economy. So with that, if I could ask you to identify yourself and then ask your question, and then I'll determine who's the best one to answer it. Yes, sir. Barry? Yes. I know their average salary is below $30,000 a year at this point in time, about $28,000 to $29,000 a year. This is a 12-month job, a very dangerous job. I mentioned this in my State of the State speech, where we're having many of our correction officers injured on the job, and we need to make sure we move their salary to ensure that we keep the well-qualified ones that are very important. And there are a lot of correctional issues that we're encountering right now that Secretary Perry is recognizing and taking action on. And one of the first is dealing with the pay that has been unacceptable for the past decade. Lee, will you answer that?
It depends on the correction officer. So the idea is to
get back here. Yeah.
Sorry. The idea is to make a distinction based on what kind of prison they work in. So right now that differentiation isn't made. So it's putting a completely new salary schedule in place, and it phases in over 3 years. So any number I gave you on an average would be misleading.
I've been, Secretary Perry has really had to educate us as he's come in, and we're very pleased with his leadership about the risk that these officers are taking every day. They're behind the scenes. We don't talk about them. We're now exposing some of the challenges that we have in our prisons, and there are many more challenges that we're going to be addressing. This is not the only challenge that we have in our prisons that we'll be talking about in the near future, but is of great concern to this governor, and we've got a lot of fixing to do in that area. Yes, Gary. Okay. The question for those who may be watching is about the pay raises regarding state employees and also other educational employees. I'm going to have you kind of refer to the details, and then I'll add on with any extra.
So our thinking about an across-the-board pay raise is that what we should do in a situation of limited availability is use the money where it can make the most difference, consistent with our approach to the budget overall. And an across-the-board pay raise probably is not the most effective way of doing that. So there's a significant commitment to state employees in this budget and in every budget, 22% going to the retirement plan and to the health plan. That's buried in those pie charts because it affects every department. There's about $81 million in longevity pay going to state employees, 40,000 state employees. And we have the increases that we talked about for teachers, for the highway patrol, for corrections officers. Beyond that, we have the $82 million that I mentioned. And our feeling is that is going to be better spent targeting hard to fill and hard to retain positions. We'll be working with the departments to use it most effectively, and the departments will have some input about where it can be best spent, but targeted is better than across the board when it comes to trying to attract and retain effective state employees in our view.
And reward.
And reward. Attract, retain, and motivate state employees. When it comes to teacher pay, there's really 4 elements without getting too far into the weeds. You have the increase in the minimum salary to $35,000, and then you have the movement along the pay scale, and that's not something to be overlooked. Previous administration froze the movement on the pay scale, and so those 2 pieces alone are about $111 million each year of the biennium. There's also a piece that holds harmless senior teachers so that they don't make anything less under the pay plan. And then the final piece is the pay for performance, pay for effectiveness plan that I outlined, which is a phase-in approach. It's $15 million over the biennium. But we think, consistent with what I said about state employees more generally, once you have everybody to a minimum and once you've moved people along the salary schedule, that additional resources beyond that, incremental resources beyond that, should really be focused on the teachers who are most effective and are making the most difference in the classroom, and that's the objective of that $15 million. The hold harmless affects about, I think it's less than 4,000 teachers that are affected. Just make sure that you don't end up making any less money than you did the year before.
This is based upon a philosophy of trying to let the decision makers closest to the employees make the decisions on pay raises and reward the high performance, reward those where we may have the highest attrition. And this is not just for education anymore, but this is for all state employees. I'd like to thank our state personnel director, who is implementing for the first time in state government a performance management plan. We're actually beginning to roll out training on actually doing evaluations on and making recommendations how we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of each employee of state government. And this is a major change in the culture of state government, where we want to reward the high performance and we want to improve those who aren't performing at the level that we expect. And it's allowing the principals and the superintendents in education to make those decisions on where best to put that money and toward employees. And the same thing with my cabinet secretaries. It's giving them the flexibility on where best to direct that money, whether it be high need positions or high market value positions or high performance individuals. So that's a change in the culture that I promise to implement. In future years, we hope as the economy recovers, we'll have more revenue available to continue this practice and have more money to reward good state employees, which we have many. Yes, sir. John Camp, ABC 11. Good seeing you. That is the question from John Camp of ABC is talking about the gas tax and other revenue regarding transportation. That is an excellent question. Therefore, I'm going to have my excellent budget director give you the details.
So what we did, you're right, we assumed the Senate proposal in modeling revenues for purposes of forecasting. You need a number to put in the budget for forecasting revenues, so we assumed that 35-cent level. We did that predominantly because that was the only proposed legislation that was out there when we put the budget together. Obviously, there's now a competing House bill that was just proposed recently after we finished the budget preparations. We don't have a specific proposal on the gas tax in this budget. We obviously look forward to working with the General Assembly to craft something that works for everybody, reconciling those two somewhat competing proposals, but we think what we've modeled here in this budget is conservative. We don't agree. So just as we do not believe that not increasing something as much as it would otherwise be increased is not a cut. We don't believe that would be a cut. We don't think decreasing something as much as it would otherwise be decreased is a tax hike. based on a particular forecast of gas prices, which, as recent history shows, nobody can successfully do. We don't believe that a decrease less than would otherwise be decreased is a tax hike.
This is why I asked him to answer the question, John. I would say this. I think the Senate and the House, and we've been in discussions with the leadership on this issue, we're very close with each other. A little different formulas between the 35 and the 36. Our major goal is to stabilize the revenue sources that we have, stabilize and maintain the revenue sources that we have. So we're working very closely with House and Senate leaders. The 36 and 35 actually can't be compared because they have a little differential in how it's formulated, and that's why there's even confusion between the 35 and 36, because they're really apples to oranges. But in the long run, they all come out about the same way. But that's why the budget director is the budget director, and I'm the governor who can better explain it. Yes, ma'am. Yes. The question was regarding Medicaid expansion. Let me just correct. Between now and the court hearing, Secretary Voss and her team and myself are exploring all alternatives. We're not just stopping, waiting for the Supreme Court case, but we recognize the Supreme Court case could have major ramifications on everything related to health care, including Medicaid. So, but in between now and the Supreme Court case, which is of great concern to me because no one in Washington, from the president to the Congress, is preparing any alternative scenarios regarding their case, and I said that directly to the president in the White House last week. I've directed my team to do two things. One is, and I've told the legislators that I'm working on this, is look at all the alternatives that's happening with expanding insurance for the uninsured in other states, including Indiana and Idaho and other states, Pennsylvania recently, and also looking at what happened in Tennessee. We're looking at their plan, looking at what waivers are given, what waivers we think we would need to have a North Carolina plan and not a Washington plan, and then also look at the 10% issue, because if we even did Medicaid expansion, is there a institution or a pot of money that could cover the extra 10%? So we're looking at those as I evaluate whether or not to recommend that to the people of North Carolina and to the legislature. Also, in that same vein, we're working extremely hard and looking at potential scenarios if the Supreme Court case rejects the president's argument regarding the current writing of the bill, which is basically one or two lines, which is being debated. I think the debate started yesterday, I believe, and I've been reading some of those articles. And again, I specifically asked the president at the White House last week, I think it was last week, the storms have gotten my calendar off a little bit, but I specifically asked the president that is there a way that the White House and the president can work with governors to look at the scenarios that could occur if the Supreme Court rejects what is termed as Obamacare. The response I got from the president was threefold. One is, first, he doesn't think the Supreme Court will do that. Well, there's disagreement in legal circles on that. The second response he gave me is he presented his argument how much Obamacare was working. And the third piece of that argument was, well, if the Supreme Court does reject it, just move to a state exchange. Well, the concept of moving just to a state exchange is much more complex than just saying move to it the next day. There are implications regarding operations and management and money. And even if it works, there are states where it's been a total disaster. So that's why I asked specifically to the president. I make the same request to the Republican Senate and House members to let's work together to develop a potential alternative plan if the scenario occurs where the Supreme Court turns down the current bill that was passed by the House and Senate several years ago, and the dilemma is now people are reading it, including the Supreme Court. So that's what we're doing. We're on a parallel path in that regard. big decisions ahead. Yes, sir. Hey, Bill. Well, let me first speak in general. Every one of my departments, almost every one of my departments, has taken a 2% cut, including such important items as health and human services. So again, one of my major directives is to more efficiently and effectively deliver our services, understanding the financial constraints that we have in the national and state economy. And no one should be exempt from that. And we've talked to the university leaders about this, and we've talked to the members of the Board of Governors about this, and what they like is the flexibility that we're giving them. Instead of the politicians out of Raleigh telling the universities how to find savings, we're giving them the flexibility to do that. In the past, they've got the directive of what to reduce or increase out of Raleigh. Those days are ending. We want to give that flexibility to both our universities and community colleges, and by the way, to our superintendents throughout all of 100 counties. So that's part of our goal. I also want to emphasize that we've also initiated some economic development initiatives where we've put a tremendous amount of money into them regarding research, which is a huge attribute to our university system. So I just want to make sure that you don't look just like we used to in the silos of each funding source, but look at the overlap of other funding that we've presented, which will be a great benefit to our universities, which also complement our ability to close the skills gap and recruit new businesses and venture capitals and entrepreneurs to North Carolina. So I encourage all of you, we're presenting the budget from a more macro as opposed to a micro silo way that has been done in past. And I'll have Lee add anything else to that. Okay. Yes, sir. Can we get back with you on that? We'd be glad. Again, it's very hard to calculate, but we'll get back with you on that. The question was what the average. And again, we're changing the basic paradigm of how we evaluate and distribute our limited tax dollars. So your question is based upon the old paradigm. The new paradigm is directing our monies toward where we're having the highest attrition, where the greatest need is, based upon the market performance and also based upon leadership of teaching. And this applies not only to our K through 12, I think this is also applying to our community colleges and to our universities and all state employees, because we're really speaking in a different paradigm that's more market-oriented than civil service-oriented. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's good to see there's a picture with you right there, the insider. Yeah, I'll have Lee go through that. Thank you.
That's right. There's a small increase in community college fees. I think it goes from $72 to $76 per credit hour in the community college system. That's tuition. There are some isolated other places where we have either proposed increasing user fees or admission fees, with the state attractions being an obvious area. We do comparative studies and try and look at what comparable attractions are charging in other states and try and make sure that we're in line with other states. We're not doing it as a way of, we're not jacking up admission prices to state attractions as a way of desperately trying to close a budget gap. We're just trying to make sure we're charging a fair rate and in line with comparable attractions in neighboring states.
One more, and then we'll get going. Yes, sir.
Being debated
yeah.
in the House, I believe, as we speak. One of the arguments against that are included in that program is that they're going to be coming out of other budget money. The argument for the program is that this is money that tax dollars the state wouldn't get otherwise, because if these companies didn't come here, they wouldn't be paying taxes at all. How do you explain the $99 million in this budget versus that argument in favor of money?
I'm going to allow Lee to explain the financial net gain to the state of North Carolina.
So the important thing about the funding for the programs that go into NC Competes, 1NC, JMAC, JDIG, is that the money that's in the budget here is to fund grants that have already been made. So the NC Competes legislation that's in the General Assembly now is debating new funding for grants that won't cost the budget money until the next biennium. So you're talking about two different pots of money. You have a broader question in there about the value of incentives. I think the administration's been clear that nobody likes incentives. In an abstract world, would all prefer not to have them. We don't live in an abstract world. We live in a competitive world, and to not have them would be tying both of our hands behind our backs as we try and create new jobs in North Carolina.
And I think the other word that is more accurate is it's really reimbursements on what has already been paid. It's not cash out front. It's reimbursements based upon what's already been paid. And I think some of the way it's been explained is people just assume we're just giving cash that we have and giving to them. We're giving back reimbursements based upon money that has been committed to the state of North Carolina, which we would not have had before. So it's a tough message to communicate, but it's an accurate message. And regarding the marketplace, this is the marketplace. We're competing against other states and nations who are want to build careers and jobs, and that's our number one goal at this point in time. And so I think our budget reflects that. I'm excited about the new way we're now not just talking about the budget, but we're actually developing a long-term strategy that will have a long-term impact on all our citizens in North Carolina. Thank you all very much. It's an honor to have you here. Excellent job. Thank you very much.